one of my greatest joys was serving as the university chaplain at Clark Atlanta University for several years. And so once I left Clark Atlanta University, I returned here again to Nashville and took a faculty position at Vanderbilt.
And so in a real sense, you've been involved with the church one way or the other, not only all of your life, but it seems that many members of your family were also involved with the church for all of, and I would imagine for a long time it has been the Methodist Church. Would that be a fair assumption in reference to that?
It has been. It has been. Growing up, I remember sitting, in the pew listening to my grandfather preach, and he knew each member by their names, their faces, and their stories. And every Sunday, he'd find a way to integrate their stories and their hearts and minds with a word from the Lord and uplift the people who had often been downtrodden by the world. And so that was the beginning of my introduction to African American biblical interpretation. It was sitting by my grandfather and watching him deal with what was going on around him, what was the ways that the community was being assaulted in the 50s and 60s, and hearing those stories about how he dealt with how he dealt with not only the church, but how he empowered the church to deal with the world. And later on, as I would sit with him in these late 70s and early 80s, I learned the power of what it meant to be that kind of a pastor.
Very good. And so let's look at some of the areas dealing with African Americans and biblical interpretation. I know that there are so many parallels in terms of the African story and the Bible that we've heard many of them time and time again, but from a professional and from a scholastic point of view, talk about it from that point of view.
Well, I think African Americans, interestingly enough, from the beginning of our journey here in the Americas, have gravitated toward the Exodus story. And that's because there's so many easy parallels between the Exodus story and the African American experience in bondage. The themes of bondage and slavery easily transfer to the African American experience in the United States, and figures like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and so many others are often signified with the identity of Moses. And African Americans have found themselves reading the Bible in what we call a figurative way. That is, to take the Bible and look at it not only historically, but to understand that these historical themes find their way into the present and tell us about the future. So we read our own story through these themes. And so figuratively, we live into the text.
Very good. So what we'll do, we'll take our first commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll have 8 minutes, and we'll allow you to continue this discussion. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. You don't know what's going on. Yeah, I appreciate you. Very good.
No, I'm happy to do it. I next time you got to call me early though. You got to let me.
Well, it never happens
call me
that way.
the night before.
It never happens that way. Dr. Baldwin introduced you to us, and you got to be ready. I mean,
he's a dear friend of mine.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've known him. I was over at Vanderbilt from 71 to 76. And I met most of the folks over there then. You see, and a lot of folks. You didn't know Reverend Kelly Miller Smith.
I did not know him. No.
Yeah, that was after. Yeah, he was a great.
Are you ready, sir?
Yes, ma'am. African American. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking about African Americans and the Bible, And we've been given some excellent information by Dr. Marbury in reference to some of the things that Africans have been involved in dealing with the Bible. And so, Professor, let's see if we can pick up where we left off and to give you an opportunity over the next 8 minutes to sort of bring things together in reference to the African experience and the biblical experience.
Well, as I was saying, African Americans took up the Bible in figural readings, and so we would take the Bible and read it not only historically, but we would read our own story into the text, and we understood that if the narrative ended this way, in a particular way for the Hebrews, then we believed it would end this way for us. So if God rescued the Hebrews from bondage, then we believe that God would rescue us from bondage. If God abhorred the slavery in Egypt, then God abhors slavery in the United States and oppression in the United States. And those types of readings empowered us. Now, we didn't originate those types of readings. You have to know that the Puritans themselves understood themselves as living through the Exodus story. They saw tyranny in Europe, tyranny in Britain, and read that as ancient Egypt, and saw their journey to the New World as a journey across the Jordan to Canaan. Now, as African Americans, when we pick up the story, we generally pick up the first 14 chapters, that is the slavery in Egypt and freedom at the Red Sea.
How we got over.
That's right. The Puritans, however, picked up the next part of the text. That is, they became God's military arm, cleaning out Canaan. And they lived that out in relation to the Native Americans. And so we see very different readings and gravitation toward very different parts of the Exodus story with the Puritans and then and later successive generations of Americans and African Americans in the ways that we took up the text, primarily for freedom and then toward uplift. So two very different ways of taking up the text. What was interesting to me, what has always been interesting to me growing up, is how the Bible can mean one thing to one congregation or one group of people or one region of the nation, and the same biblical text can mean something entirely different to another congregation, to a congregation next door, down the street, or in another region. And so in the United States, we have not only red states and blue states, but we have red congregations and blue congregations reading from the same text, believing entirely differently about who God is and God's activity in the world and how we should respond to God's activity in the world. So in my book, I look at ways that, my recent book, Pillars of Cloud and Fire, I look at ways that African Americans have taken up the text, beginning in the antebellum period, just before the Civil War. And so I look at, for example, in the antebellum period, African Americans read the text and understood that the Promised Land was emancipation, and once emancipation came in 1865. We began to reconfigure our understanding of Exodus. We held on to the same story, but the Promised Land then became uplift. How do we find a way to gain some economic status, educational status? How do we raise our quality of life in a world that still hates us? And so from 1865 up until the Harlem Renaissance, during the era of Reconstruction, you find African Americans reading the Exodus story still, but no longer talking about emancipation, but the Promised Land became uplift. In the Harlem Renaissance, you find figures like Zora Neale Hurston in her book Moses, Man of the Mountain, and others, taking up the Exodus story again, but this time no longer talking about uplift, but talking about what it means to be the Harlem Renaissance's new Negro.
Be creative in a real sense.
Creative, but what does it mean to become a new person absent the manacles of slavery? How do we pull off the vestiges of slavery? And that was at a time when in American popular culture, you saw you saw Sambos, you saw Pickaninnies, you saw all of those, Jemimas, all of those, all blackface, all those stereotypical figures used to advertise products. They were all a part of the cultural landscape. And the Harlem Renaissance writers wanted to produce a more authentic representation, as they saw it, of African American cultural life. And so for them, who is this new Negro, this new African American person who is not seen through the stereotypes of the white gaze, but seen in a way that is authentically herself or himself. And Zora Neale Hurston works hard. And Langston Hughes does the same thing, but Zora Neale Hurston focuses on the Exodus story in a powerful way. She reconfigures in I think a novel-length sermon, really, reconfigures the Exodus story in a way that speaks to empowerment for African Americans and offers a critique of leadership and empowers the people. So if you haven't read Moses, Man of the Mountain, powerful, powerful. And so once the Harlem Renaissance sort of dies down after the Great Depression, of course, and then we get into World War II, we begin the Civil Rights Movement. And here now, African Americans begin to rethink, again, what is this promised land and what is slavery? Slavery is not being enslaved. It's not what it meant to live life in Reconstruction. But now slavery is living under Jim Crow. And the promised land is, what does it mean to have the Voting Rights Act, the Public Accommodations Bill? The promised land becomes signified by the word integration, but I think that word integration doesn't quite capture it. Actually, what African Americans were fighting for was freedom. How can we be free to live peaceably in our own communities? Can we be free to be treated as equal citizens in the United States? And so civil rights and civil attainment become the metaphor for the promised land. And so as African American preachers talked about the promised land, it was about ending Jim Crow. It was about ending segregation. It was about finding new ways of living as first-class citizens with equal rights. And then finally in the Black Power era, just after the death of Dr. King, after the assassination, we find again African Americans reconfiguring this Exodus story, and particularly folk like Reverend Albert Clegg.
And so what we'll do, we'll take this final break and then we'll come back and continue. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. They missed something. They don't know they've missed anything. And so, but if you sit up there and don't say anything, then that draws attention. So just keep on talking. I know that I've been doing it for almost 30 years. So all you got to do is keep on. They don't nobody paying any attention to what you're saying.
I love it. I love it.
No, that's powerful though.
That's helpful. Really. Yeah.
No, there, it really does have an impact. Yeah, that's why I've been involved with so long that it makes a difference. It really does. Okay, you ready for this final segment?
All right. Let me give me one more minute. Let me think.
And so this is our 10-minute segment.
All right. 10 minutes.
So everything that you wanted to say before you got here, this is your opportunity to say it.
Okay. All right. I think.
Okay, you have to take that break every time.
Every time, yeah. All right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Professor Mulberry. He's given us some information in reference to African Americans and the Bible. And of course, let's take the final segment here, Professor. to not only talk about African Americans and the Bible, but to try to inform our audience in reference to what it means to be an African American in reference to the Bible.
All right. Well, I think when we in the last segment we were kind of going through a chronology of ways that African Americans use the Bible, and you can look at in the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King's sermons, particularly his sermon "Birth of a New Nation" or his sermon "Death of Evil on the Seashore," where both take up the Exodus story and talk about ways that African Americans need to move toward freedom. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. does the same thing in sermons at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And in the Black Power era, we see Albert Clegg doing the same thing. But for Albert Clegg, Reverend Clegg did not see civil rights, or the attainment of civil rights, as the promised land. He saw, in the Black Power era, he saw autonomy, that is self-direction, as the promised land. And so he was hoping for African Americans to come together to support their own businesses, control their own schools, find ways to protect their own communities from police brutality and so forth. And so as he interpreted the Exodus story, the promised land becomes a sort of utopian life, a way that African Americans could live without the assault of the vestiges of segregation and Jim Crow.
In other words, a way to live away from the white man while believing in the Bible itself.
Right,
Because we've already been separated and segregated, and
Right.
we had to make come to some kind of recognition of that. And is that what we're saying here?
Yeah, for him it was a way of living outside of white racism. Yeah, how do we live outside of, and how do we fortify ourselves against it? And as he saw it, that means you have to control your own institutions, local control. You have to control your own schools, you have to control your own businesses, and your own communities. And as he understood it, that was the only way that you could earn some respect in this society, that we would have to respect ourselves and control our own interests in this world. And so those are sort of the 5 eras, if you will: the antebellum period, Reconstruction, Harlem Renaissance, Civil Rights, and the Black Power era for African American biblical interpretation. And you see some of that even today as we look at again ways that, particularly in the South, the Bible is still a part of our cultural vernacular. You see it not only in church or in sermons, but we also see the Bible used in political speeches. I mean, you almost can't run for president if you don't make some reference to the Bible, even if all you know is 2 Corinthians. You still have to make some reference to the Bible. Yeah,
that's still a reference.
Still a reference, right?
Yeah,
right, because it
means that at least you've seen it.
You've seen it.
You
You may never have heard it in church, right? But you read it, and it said 2 Corinthians.
That's exactly what it said.
That's about all you know. Yeah. And so, because the Bible is, pervades our culture in a way that I think no other book has. And so, and we still see ways that communities interpret the Bible in terms of their own interests. I mean, you think about Christian evangelicals today, particularly white Christian evangelicals today. You find more and more this identification of Donald Trump, right? President Trump, with the idea that this is a messianic figure, a figure sent by God to lead the United States. And you wonder what happened to the kind of Christian conservatives that were around in the 80s, where there was a certain, at least some adherence to some idea of moral authority. And so there's now a way of taking up and finding biblical texts to support Trump's racism, to support his the ways that he's characterized and demonized immigrants at the border, the misogyny, certainly, and the ways that he's characterized and demonized immigrants at the border, the policies that he has put in place that have ripped children away from families, and the ways that he has emboldened a certain kind of police brutality with his comments. And so as you think about ways that, you know, where Christian evangelicals were in the 80s, those types of things would not have been tolerated. But here, as Christian evangelicals now see Trump as affirming their cultural interests, right? It's a white cultural interest over against a broader presidential ideal, where a president for all the United States.
Christian interests, which would include
exactly
for everybody.
For everybody. They have found ways to, for example, I've read sermons and seen churches affirm Trump as a figural David. You know, they said David had flaws, but he was still used by God. He was the apple of God's eye. And you see this interpretation in churches. So again, the Bible comes in the book of Kings, where David's story is not, David's story is not a, it's not a story of a king who had no moral failings. David's story is full of moral failings. And so Trump's moral failings are read through that, and it creates a space for evangelicals to support Trump anyway. And so as I work with African American biblical interpretation, I invite congregations to take up the Bible in ways that affirm life and culture, affirm Black life and culture, take up the Bible in ways that speak for the thriving of all humanity, take up the Bible in ways that speak to the kind of world that God would want for us all, not just for some segment, and to read the text in ways that speak to justice for those who have been downtrodden. I mean, what does the text say about the widow, the stranger, and the orphan? What does it say to us when we think about immigrants? What does it say to us to follow someone like Jesus who healed people for free, didn't ask them about a medical card or insurance or how much they could pay, but what does it say about a society, our society, where thousands of people die because they don't have adequate health insurance? What does it say about our society, one of the wealthiest in the world, where children die here in Nashville of poverty?
All over the world.
Yes, right, but right here, especially here, but all over the world. And what does it say about our society when we take the Bible and somehow read it in a way that affirms that kind of repression of just life? I encourage congregations to take up the Bible and read it in ways that God has called all of us to be for each other and with each other in community and in family, and to work for the betterment of human society. And that's something that I've traced in African American biblical interpretation, and you find it in certain progressive strands of white biblical interpretation as well. But you don't find it here in this new brand of Southern Christian evangelicalism. And that's something that as we struggle to figure out, that will be a major challenge for us going forward.
I think you can only say that there's no room for it. You see, I think that things are going so fast and so unusual that a lot of folks have to re-examine how they feel in reference to the Christian religion and in reference to the Bible. But I certainly agree with you that the time that we're living in now are essentially different than the times that we've talked about up until now. And so let me thank you, Professor, for bringing that excellent information by. And I'm encouraged by some of the things that you've said, and I believe that the things that we've talked about today will have an impact upon some of the things when we talk about the Bible. People rarely think in terms of the impact that the Bible is having and has had upon all of us. But I want to thank you for coming by and giving us that excellent information today. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week